The night the blizzard swept down on Ridgemont, Ohio, felt as if someone had just switched off all the lights of the world. The wind howled across every rooftop, dragging the outdoor temperature down to minus 38 degrees Celsius. The roads disappeared under thick layers of snow, the power went out completely, and the entire town sank into an icy, numbing silence. And at the end of a dead-end street called Maple Terrace, in a small house that had almost been forgotten, a 74-year-old black woman heard 3 heavy knocks on the door, echoing through the darkness like an undeniable cry for help. She opened the door. On the porch stood 9 men from the Hells Angels leather jackets, soaked with cold tattoos running down their necks, snow clinging white to their shoulders and hair. One of them was bleeding, his breath broken as if it was about to fade out. In that situation, most people would have locked the door, would have called the police, would have pretended they heard nothing. But Martha Cole didn't. She stood there for a moment, looking at them as if she were looking at a storm that had lost its way into her home. Then she opened the door wider and let them in. She lit the fire. She put a pot on the stove. She cooked soup with whatever was left in the house. She handed out blankets and her late husband's old coat. She shared the last bits of food she had, not keeping a single portion for herself. She didn't know that the man standing at the front of that group was not just a man lost in a storm, but a man whose worth exceeded the entire neighborhood combined. And what happened the next morning was not just a story. It was a turning point that changed everything. She did not hesitate. And that moment alone said everything that needed to be known. But before stepping into that night, one thing must be understood very clearly. It is necessary to know who Martha Cole is, and why someone like her would open that door on a night when the entire outside world chose to turn away. If you believe that kindness still exists in a world that can sometimes feel too cold, and that even a small act can change a person's life, don't forget to like and subscribe to help spread a little more of that positivity further out into the world. Martha Cole is 74 years old and lives alone in a small house at the end of Maple Terrace in the town of Ridgemont, Ohio. This used to be a thriving industrial town, but now it is different. Very different. The steel mills shut down long ago, leaving behind abandoned structures, sparsely populated streets, and a silence that stretches on uncomfortably. Martha's house leans slightly to one side, its roof worn down with a few spots once patched with thin metal sheets. In winter it is freezing. In summer it is stifling. But she still lives there and has never left. Not because she cannot, but because she does not want to. Every morning Martha wakes up very early before the sky is fully light. She brews coffee using an old kettle that has been with her for nearly 20 years. The sound of boiling water crackles in the small kitchen, and then the smell of coffee spreads familiar like a habit that cannot be given up. After that, she slowly walks to the back door and leaves out some food for 2 stray cats that often come by. She never gave them official names, but over time she started calling one big and the other small. They are not friendly, but they do not leave either. In the cold of this town, that is its own kind of companionship. Inside the house, everything is old. The sofa is worn out, the dining table slightly uneven with one short leg, and a few photographs on the wall have faded with time. Among them is a picture of Martha with her husband, George Cole. He passed away many years ago after a workplace accident at the steel mill. Since then, she has kept everything exactly the same, as if, by not changing anything, the memories will not disappear. Ridgemont no longer has much life in it. Shops close one after another. Some houses are abandoned, their wooden doors rotting. The younger generation has all left. Only the elderly remain, and those who no longer have the strength to start over somewhere else. Martha knows this well, but she does not complain. She simply keeps living one day at a time. She lives on social benefits barely enough to pay for utilities and basic necessities. But Martha is always very careful. Never excess, never lacking. There are days she only eats one meal, but she still saves the rest for someone who might need it more. In this neighborhood, people are used to her. An elderly woman, quiet, always helping when she can. If a family lacks food, she brings canned goods over. If a child has no one to watch them, she sits and helps. No one hires her, no one pays her. But she still does it. People once asked why she did not leave. Martha simply gave a very short answer. That there were still people here who needed her. That day the weather began to change in the afternoon. The air grew colder. The wind became stronger than usual. On the old radio in her kitchen, warnings were broadcast about a major snowstorm moving into the area. It could last through the night, possibly into the next day. Martha listened, but did not react much. She simply checked the windows again, pulled up extra plastic sheets to block the wind, and placed more blankets on the sofa. Old habits. She had lived through winters like this before. As night fell, the neighborhood grew quiet. Lights in a few houses turned on, then slowly went out as the wind strengthened. The atmosphere became heavy, as if the town was waiting for something unnamed. Martha sat at the kitchen table, finishing the last of her coffee. Outside the window, snow began to fall lightly. At first only a few flakes, but soon it thickened, whitening the entire sky. She stood up and checked the oil lamp in the living room one last time. Its yellow light was weak, but enough to see everything inside the house. Then she sat down on the chair and pulled the blanket over herself. Outside, the wind began to howl more violently, sweeping across the old rooftops of Ridgemont. There were faint metallic sounds like something shaking in the cold wind. But inside Martha's house, everything remained calm. Until there was a strange sound. At first very faint, like footsteps in the snow. Then it stopped. Then it continued again. Irregular, uncertain. Martha opened her eyes and listened. The sound did not belong to anyone in the neighborhood, not a neighbor, not someone familiar. Then came the knocking at the door, heavy and urgent. Martha did not immediately stand up. She simply sat still for a moment, looking toward the door. Outside was a blizzard, a freezing night, something no one would want to face. The knocking came again. This time, almost exhausted, Martha placed her hand on the table and slowly stood up. She walked toward the door, each step slow on the old wooden floor. Her hand rested on the doorknob. A very brief pause. Then the door opened. Cold wind rushed in, immediately bringing a piercing freeze. Before her stood a stranger in the middle of the storm. And behind that figure, there were more. Martha had not yet spoken when the wind surged again, shaking the door in her grip. She held it steady and looked straight outside. Then she opened it a little wider and said a very simple sentence. "Come in before you freeze to death." The door opened wider in the howling wind. The wind slammed into the house so hard that the oil lamp on the table tilted its yellow light, breaking into uneven streaks across the wall. Martha held the door open for a few more seconds, then stepped aside. The first man to enter moved heavily, as if he were dragging the storm itself behind him. His leather jacket was covered in snow, his hood soaked through his breath, sharp and broken. He did not speak at first, just stood there for a few beats as if confirming that he had truly escaped what was outside. Then the rest followed one by one. One staggered in having to grip the doorframe for support. Another quickly removed his gloves, his hands purple-red from the cold. One could not stand straight at all and collapsed onto the wooden floor as if his legs no longer obeyed him. The small, quiet house was suddenly filled with unfamiliar sounds. Heavy breathing, wet fabric dropping onto the floor, wood creaking as the group squeezed inside. Martha did not ask many questions. She simply turned and walked into the kitchen. "Close the door," she said briefly. One of them pulled it shut. The wind was blocked outside, but its howling still slipped through the gaps like a beast unwilling to leave. In the dim yellow light, Martha could see them more clearly. They were not the kind of men who looked harmless or easy to approach. Leather jackets, tattoos, strange symbols on their coats. But what caught her attention most was not their appearance. It was their condition. They were exhausted. The youngest-looking one, his wet hair stuck to his forehead, was clutching his left arm tightly. Blood had seeped through the fabric, forming a dark stain. He gritted his teeth with every slight movement. The man closest to Martha spoke first, his voice hoarse. "We got stuck on the road. All the bikes are down. Couldn't go any further." Martha looked straight at him, asking nothing. Then she turned and scanned the rest of the group as if counting them. 1, 2, 3, until all 9 were accounted for. None of them had enough strength left to argue or explain further. "Sit down," Martha said. No one objected. They began to find places, some on the sofa, some on the floor, some leaning against the wall. The small house suddenly felt strangely cramped, as if everything inside it had been pushed aside to make room for survival. Martha walked over to the injured one. "Give me your arm." He hesitated slightly, then complied. When the sleeve was pulled up, the wound became clearer. Not deep enough to be immediately life-threatening, but enough to make the cold outside far more dangerous. Martha said nothing more. She went into the bathroom and took out an old metal box. When she returned, she placed it on the table as if she had done this 100 times before. "Hold still." The young man nodded slightly, his lips still trembling. She worked slowly. No rush, no wasted movement. The faint sound of metal touching water pouring into a bowl, then the smell of antiseptic filling the air. The room grew quieter, as everyone realized she was not uncertain at all. One of the men looked around his eyes, stopping at the old stove. "You live alone here?" There was no immediate answer. Martha finished bandaging the wound before speaking. "Not many people live alone around here anymore." The sentence sounded like a plain fact, not a complaint. Outside, the storm did not stop. Snow struck the windows in heavy waves, thicker and stronger. The house felt completely cut off from the world beyond. Another man in the group began to shake noticeably. Wet clothes, no warmth left. Martha saw it. She stood up and walked down the hallway. The cupboard door opened, revealing neatly stacked old blankets. She carried them out one by one and handed them over without distinguishing between anyone. "Wrap yourselves up." No one asked where she had so many things in such a small house. They simply took them. One of them, the oldest-looking man, looked at her longer than the others. "Aren't you afraid of us?" Martha paused for a beat. Then she answered very calmly. "I'm more afraid of what's outside." No one spoke after that. After a while, the room began to settle. Breathing slowed. The injured man stopped shivering as violently. Some leaned against the wall, eyes closed, but not fully asleep, just resting. Martha moved between the kitchen and the living room. She boiled water, opened the last few canned goods she had. Not much, but enough to share. When she placed the simple bowls on the table, no one started eating immediately. They looked at each other first, then picked up their spoons. The atmosphere in the room shifted slowly. No longer panic, but not yet safety either. Just the absence of immediate death. Martha sat down on a chair in the corner. Back straight, hands resting on the table. She did not sleep. One of the men looked up at her. "What's your name?" Martha stayed silent for a moment, as if the question did not matter, but she answered anyway. Not necessary to remember. Outside, the wind still swept across the roof, but inside voices had lowered. A few people began leaning their heads against the wall. Some closed their eyes longer. Martha stood up and checked the lamp again. The light was still there. She gently pulled a blanket over the shoulders of someone nearby, then returned to her seat. No one said anything else. The house continued holding the long night outside, as if it had been built for exactly that purpose. In a corner of the room, one of the men shifted slightly, touching the bandaged wound. No one noticed, except Martha. After a while, the house fell into a silence heavier than the wind outside. Not a comfortable silence, but the kind that comes from people being too exhausted to say anything more. The oil lamp was still burning, but weaker than before. The yellow light had shrunk barely enough to keep the shapes in the room from dissolving into darkness. One of the men shifted slightly. The wooden chair let out a small creak. He opened his eyes and looked around as if he had forgotten where he was. It took him a few seconds to remember. Across the room, the injured man was half asleep, his head tilted to one side, his breathing steadier than before. The bandage on his arm was slightly stained, but no longer bleeding through. Martha remained in the same seat. She had not changed her posture in a long time. Only her eyes moved occasionally, observing everyone in the room. Another man sat up and rubbed his hands together. The cold was still in his bones, even under the thick blanket. "No signal," he said quietly, almost to himself. No one answered right away. After a moment, the oldest man in the group looked toward the window. The snow outside was still falling, but no longer as violently as before. Just a thick white layer covering everything. "The bikes are still out on the road," he said. "We left everything behind." There was no clear regret in his voice, only a fact being stated again. Martha stood up and walked toward the kettle. She added more fire, her movements slow but steady. In the small kitchen, the faint sound of metal rang as she placed the pot on the stove. No one asked what she was doing. But the smell of hot water began to spread, making the air in the room slightly less dry. One of the men pulled his blanket tighter and looked around the house. "How long have you been living here alone?" Martha did not answer immediately. She poured water into a cup and placed it on the table. "Long enough that I stopped counting," she said. No one asked further. Outside the window, the sky remained a heavy gray. There was no sign the weather would change anytime soon. Only the occasional wind slipping through the wooden gaps, stretching like a tired breath. The injured man shifted slightly, opened his eyes for a moment, then closed them again. Another man looked over and asked softly, "Does it still hurt?" He shook his head slightly, but said nothing more. Martha brought out more warm water and placed it near them. She did not say, "Drink this," or be careful. She simply set it down and walked away. Some drank immediately. Others hesitated before taking it. Time in the room moved slower than usual. No one checked the clock. No one mentioned the time. Only the oil lamp dimming being adjusted, then dimming again. One of them started talking, unclear whether to break the silence or to forget the cold still in his body. "Last time we passed through here, there was still a gas station open," he said. "Probably closed now." No one reacted much. But at least there was a voice. Martha still did not join in. She simply listened. After a while, she stood up and walked to a corner of the house, opening a low wooden cabinet. Inside were simple things, boxes of crackers, a few cans of food, some rice. She took them out one by one and placed them on the table. "Eat more," she said. One of them looked at her, slightly hesitant. "You're sure you don't need to keep this?" Martha shook her head slightly. "Keeping it won't change anything if you don't have the strength to move on." No one spoke after that. They ate more slowly than before. No longer rushing like at the beginning, but no longer keeping distance either. The room gradually developed its own rhythm, not chaotic anymore, but not yet peaceful. One of the men looked out the window longer than usual. "I don't think morning will make it easier," he said. No one disagreed. Martha placed one hand on the edge of the table, looking toward the front door. She stood there for a few seconds, as if calculating something. Then she turned back. "Stay until the weather clears," she said. "Not an invitation, not an order, just a decision already made." The oldest man in the group nodded. "We don't have another choice." The room fell quiet again. After a while, the light grew weaker. Martha replaced the wick, adjusting the flame, a familiar motion done without thought. Outside, the wind shifted direction. The sound against the roof changed tone, slightly farther away, but never gone. One of the men murmured, almost inaudible, "I don't know when we'll get out of here." No one answered. Martha returned to her chair. She sat down, hands resting on her knees, eyes on the strangers inside her home. The oil lamp flickered once. Near the door, a faint sound came from outside, as if something had touched the wooden frame, and vanished immediately after. No one stood up to check right away. Martha was the first to turn her head. The sound outside the door vanished quickly, so quickly that if someone had blinked, they might have thought they imagined it. Martha kept looking in that direction for a few more seconds. No one in the room stood up right away. Only silence stretched on heavy and dense, as if everyone was waiting for the next signal. Then one of the men stood up. He walked slowly toward the door and crouched down to look at the gap beneath it. There were no clear signs, only thick snow pressed in by the wind along the edge. "Probably just the wind," he said. No one objected. Martha turned back to the stove and adjusted the flame once more. The long night had begun to shift. It was no longer fully dark, but there was still no real light. A pale gray tone slipped in through the snow-covered glass. Inside the room, a few people had changed position. Those leaning against the wall stretched their legs out. The one on the sofa rolled over slowly. No one was as tense as when they first entered. One of them looked out the window. "Snow still hasn't stopped," he said. His tone carried neither hope nor disappointment, just observation. Martha did not answer. She poured more hot water into a small container and placed it on the table. Steam rose, faintly dissolving into the cold air of the room. Another man spoke more slowly. "If we can't leave tomorrow morning, we might be stuck another day." No one responded immediately. That statement did not need rebuttal. It simply hung there as a possibility. The oldest man in the group stood up and walked a few steps around the room. He studied each corner carefully, as if memorizing the layout. "This house isn't big," he said. "But keeping people alive through a night like this is unusual enough." His gaze stopped on Martha. "You prepared for this?" Martha did not look up immediately. She wiped her hands on an old towel hanging near the stove. "There was nothing to prepare," she said. "Only what hasn't broken yet." That answer made a few people fall silent again. Outside, the light was becoming clearer. Not sunlight, but the pale reflection of white snow. The entire world beyond the window looked as if it were coated in cold silver. A younger man stepped closer to the table and looked at the remaining canned food. "You gave us everything last night," he said. "Do you even have anything left for yourself?" Martha paused for a moment. "Yes," she said simply, "but I don't need it yet." No one asked further. Small movements began to return to the room. People adjusted their clothes, tightened blankets, rubbed their hands together. Bodies were slowly adapting to the indoor temperature, no longer shaking like before. The injured man was fully awake now. He looked around, then down at his bandaged arm. "It feels much better," he said quietly. There was no strong reaction, but a few eyes turned toward him in silent confirmation. Martha placed a pot of water back on the stove, not to boil for long, only to keep it warm. Meanwhile, the man near the window spoke again. "If the weather holds like this, we might be able to leave by noon." No one was certain. But that sentence was enough to shift the atmosphere slightly. There was a small change in the room. Not quite hope, not quite relief, just the instinct to attach meaning to a possible timeline. Martha looked outside again. The snow was still thick, but the wind had weakened. She turned back. "We'll only know if we can leave when we open the door," she said. No one argued. A long silence followed. Then the oldest man in the group sat down across from Martha. "How long have you lived here alone?" he asked again, as if the question had only just occurred to him. Martha did not answer immediately. She looked at the cup of water in front of her. "Long enough not to need anyone confirming it," she said. The room quieted again. A faint sound came from the roof, like snow shifting and sliding down in a mass. No one reacted. They were already starting to get used to the house's sounds. One of the men let out a quiet laugh for no clear reason. "We look like we're sheltering in someone's house in a different world," he said. No one replied, but a few faces showed they were thinking the same thing. Martha stood up and slowly walked toward the hallway. She checked the front door lock once more, then returned to the living room. The daylight outside was clearer now. Snow still covered everything, but the shapes of the neighborhood had begun to appear. The distant houses remained silent. There was no sign that the world outside had changed overnight. Inside, one man leaned against the wall, eyes closed, not fully asleep, just resting. Another checked his watch but said nothing about the time. Martha returned to her seat and sat down. No one spoke for a very long time, until another soft knock came from outside. Not loud, not urgent, just once, then silence. Every pair of eyes in the room turned toward the door. All eyes in the room turned toward the door where the sound had just echoed, and then disappeared, as if it had never existed. No one spoke immediately. Martha was the first to stand up. She did not rush, nor did she hesitate. She simply walked toward the door, as if she had been doing this for a very long time. One of the men instinctively stood up. "Let me," he said quietly. But Martha raised her hand, signaling him to stop. "Stay seated." Her voice was not loud, but it was enough to hold everyone in place. She approached the door closely and placed her hand on the lock. She paused for a moment. There was no sound outside. No strong wind. No clear footsteps. Only an unusual, extended emptiness. Then she opened the door. Cold air rushed in, immediately lighter than last night, but still enough to make the indoor light flicker slightly. Standing on the porch was a man. Not soaked in leather like the ones inside. No signs of panic. Only a dark, heavy, coat-light snow resting on his shoulders, as if he had been standing there long enough for it to settle. Behind him stood two others a few steps back. Silent. Not approaching. Martha looked at the man in front of her. Her expression did not change much, only lingered a bit longer than usual. "Who are you?" she asked. The man did not answer immediately. He looked past her into the house. He saw the 9 men scattered inside the small space. His gaze paused briefly, then returned to Martha. "We came for them." A simple sentence. No further explanation. Behind her, one of the biker men stood up sharply. "Who are you?" His voice tightened. The man outside finally stepped onto the porch. "My name is Victor Hayes." No one reacted immediately. The name meant nothing clear to the men inside. But the way he stood, and the way the two behind him kept their distance, shifted the atmosphere slightly. Victor Hayes looked directly at the biker group. "You've been heading the wrong way since last night. We tracked you from the old checkpoint on the highway." One of the bikers gave a short laugh, but not in amusement. "So you came looking for us?" "No," Victor said. "We came looking for people who went missing in the storm." The answer made the room fall into another layer of silence. Martha did not take her eyes off him. "You know them?" she asked. Victor turned to her. Partially. The air between them settled there. No one moved further. The oldest biker stepped closer to the door, standing just behind Martha. "We don't need trouble," he said. Victor nodded slightly. "I didn't bring trouble here." A pause stretched out. Snow on the porch had begun to soften under the weak morning light. Victor looked into the house again. "Is anyone injured?" Martha did not answer immediately. She only turned slightly toward the young man whose arm had been bandaged. Victor stepped half a step inside. No one stopped him. His eyes landed on the dressing. That needs cleaner bandages, he said. One of the two men behind him stepped forward slightly and opened a bag he was carrying. No one in the room had noticed it before. Martha saw that, then turned back to Victor. "You're not someone who just passed by," she said. Victor did not deny it. "I came for another reason." He paused as if weighing his words. "One of them owed me a life. No one asked who it was. The answer was not spoken, but it began to exist in the air anyway." One of the bikers glanced at the others. No one confirmed anything. Victor stepped fully into the house. No one reacted with movement. He looked around once. A small old house, but orderly in its own way. The wet, exhausted men were stabilizing. The oil lamp still burned weak but steady. His gaze rested on Martha for a long time. "You kept them alive through the night," he said. Martha replied briefly. "They kept themselves alive." Victor shook his head slightly. "No. In conditions like that, no one survives alone." No one interrupted him. Something subtle shifted in how they looked at him. Not trust yet, but no longer complete unfamiliarity. Victor turned to the injured man. "Can you walk?" The young man looked uncertain. "Maybe, if it's not far." Victor nodded. "Good." He turned to the men behind him. "Prepare transport." No one asked where the transport was. A few minutes later, a very low engine sound could be heard from the road outside. Not loud, not aggressive, just present. One of the bikers stood fully. "We're not going anywhere until we understand what's happening." Victor looked directly at him. "You're in a zone I marked 3 hours ago. If I didn't come here, another unit would have." The sentence added another layer of silence to the room. Martha looked at Victor for a long moment. "You're not an ordinary man," she said. Victor did not react to the label. "I'm just someone who knows when a situation needs to end properly." No one responded. Outside, the light had grown clearer. Snow still covered everything, but the road's shape was beginning to emerge. Victor looked at the biker group again. "You can stay a few more hours if needed, but not longer." He turned to Martha. "Thank you for keeping them alive." Martha did not return the gratitude. She only stood still. Victor stepped back toward the door. The two men behind him followed. Before leaving the porch, he paused for a moment. "We will meet again." Then he walked down the steps and disappeared into the brightening snow. The door closed. No one in the room spoke for several long seconds. Martha turned back to the biker group. No one moved. Only the morning light slowly crept further into the small house. Daylight began to emerge as the layer of snow outside thinned, revealing the cracked surfaces of Maple Terrace. The surrounding houses were still silent, but no longer felt buried as they had the night before. Inside the small house, everyone began packing up. No one spoke much. Their movements were slow, as if their bodies had not fully escaped the cold that had settled into their bones overnight. One of the bikers stood near the window staring outside for a long time before turning back. "The vehicles are at the end of the road," he said. "Someone has already brought them up." No one reacted strongly, but the atmosphere shifted. Lighter, as if a final, tight rope had finally been loosened. Martha stood near the stove. She did not take part in the small movement of activity forming in the room. She simply observed. The injured man had managed to stand. His movements were still slow, but he no longer needed support. He tried clenching his fist, then released it. "Better?" he said. No one argued. Victor Hayes did not return immediately as he had said, but his presence still lingered like something that had left but not fully disappeared. One of the men picked up his jacket. "We should go," he said quietly. Not a command, just acknowledgement. They began moving toward the door one by one. No urgency, left no panic. Only exhaustion replaced by the awareness that they still had a road ahead. Martha stepped aside as they passed. No one gave long thanks, only brief nods. The oldest man stopped at the door. "You didn't have to do all this," he said. Martha looked at him. "I didn't do it for all of you," she replied. He nodded once, then stepped outside. Footsteps crunched on the snow, gradually fading as they left the porch. A vehicle waited at the end of the road. The engine hummed softly. The group got in. Doors closed one by one. No one looked back for long. When the last vehicle rolled away, the road returned to silence. Only Martha remained standing at the door. She did not step outside immediately. She simply stood there watching the direction they had gone. The snow was still present, but no longer falling heavily. After a long moment, she turned back inside. The door closed. Inside, the room returned to its old state. No longer cramped, no heavy breathing, no collision of exhausted bodies. Only the smell of old wood, lingering warmth, and the faint light of late morning. Martha walked around the room once, collected the blankets that had been used, folding them neatly, wiped the table surface. Not because it was dirty, but out of habit. When she returned to her chair, the oil lamp was nearly extinguished. She did not relight it immediately. She simply sat down. Outside the window, the sky was fully bright. Snow reflected a pale white light, making everything clearer, but also farther away. No clear footprints remained outside the porch, only faint traces smoothed away by wind. Martha looked out for a long time. No sound of engines, no sign of Victor Hayes returning. Nothing except normality slowly reclaiming the aftermath of an abnormal night. She stood again, walked into the kitchen, placed a kettle on the stove. A small flame lit steady. While waiting for the water, she opened an old cabinet. Inside were neatly kept items, photographs, old documents, small objects no longer used. She took out one photo, looked at it for a long time, then placed it back. The water began to boil. A faint crackling sound filled the kitchen. No one else was in the house. No footsteps, no voices, no unfamiliar presence. Only the house as it had always been. But something had changed, even if small, even if hard to name. Martha poured water into a cup, sat down at the table. Outside, Maple Terrace began to show signs of movement again. Small traces of a normal day slowly returning. But the house at the end of the road remained unchanged. Martha no longer looked toward the door. She simply took a sip of water, then set the cup down. Morning light poured through the window resting on the old wooden table. There were no more knocks, no one standing on the porch. Only another day beginning like any other day that had ever begun in this place. The small house at the end of Maple Terrace returned to its familiar silence. No more heavy footsteps, no more rushed breathing of strangers sheltering through a stormy night. Only the soft morning light passing through an old window, falling onto a wooden table accustomed to solitude. Martha Cole sat there for a long time, not waiting for anything, not thinking too deeply. Just a stillness like the kind people sit in after a storm has passed, even if the sky is already clear. The footprints outside slowly faded. Snow covered everything again, erasing the boundary between last night and now. But for her, some things could never be erased by snow. In this moment seen from the outside, it was just an old house and an elderly woman living quietly in a forgotten town. But seen more deeply, it was a place where a single small decision had changed more lives than anyone could have imagined. From the storyteller's perspective, what makes this story is not the snowstorm or the men lost in the night. It is something far simpler. A door that was opened instead of locked. In this world, people are often taught to be cautious, to protect themselves, to think of themselves first. But Martha Cole did the opposite. Not because she was fearless, but because she chose not to let fear decide for her. And sometimes those small choices become the line between despair and hope. This story is not about wealth or power. It is about a woman who had very little yet still had enough to share with strangers at the moment they needed it most. And from that, something becomes very clear. A person's value is not defined by what they possess, but by what they are willing to give when no one is asking them to. In real life, not everyone will face a snowstorm or 9 strangers at their door. But everyone will face moments where they must choose between closing or opening, between turning away or staying, between silence or helping. And sometimes those moments are what define a person. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. If it touched you even a little, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that kindness still exists even in the coldest nights. And if you want more stories like this, stay with me for the journeys ahead.